Welcome to this next episode of our Rugby Bits and Pieces. And we've decided to take a little run into the Rugby Europe Championship, a competition that's not spoken about enough in South Africa and the rest of Europe. Obviously, most of the South Africans are focused on the URC, the Six Nations, and all that sort of jazz. But today I'm joined by Francisco Isaac. Francisco is a freelance writer, does a lot of great rugby. You must follow him on Twitter. He writes for Fair Play, Rugby Europe, Planet Rugby, Talking in Rugby, and Rugby Pass. Francisco, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you guys. I've been following Rugby Bits for quite a while, and Tata's hot takes are some of the are good to spice up the mornings or to soothe in when I'm going to bed at night.
No, absolutely. There's good banter. I tell you one thing, having four of us on, especially Jared. Jared hasn't been on for a while now, so he's getting a bit of heat from the guys. But you know what it's like. It's good fun. But there's so much happening and so much rugby, and I want to jump straight in. So the Rugby Europe Championship, correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially it is what we'd probably consider one tier down from the Six Nations, with European teams involved. And there are 8 teams playing: Poland, Romania, Germany, Georgia, Belgium, Portugal, Netherlands, and Spain. And it's a pathway to where?
Sorry?
It's a pathway to where? Is it do
Well, it's
World
a
Cup?
pathway to, yeah, it can be a pathway to the World Cup. Normally, well, we don't know how it's going to go for to 2027. But for example, for Rugby World Cup 2023, the qualification was done between how many points did the teams finish up in 21 and 22. So the aggregate scores sum up, and then you have the final rankings or final standings, and that gets you to the World Cup.
Okay. And and just tell us a little bit more about the competition. I mean, I've watched it for a few years, not religiously, but watched it, and I've seen like 80,000, 100,000 fans at stadiums at some stages. So it's pretty well followed.
Yeah, it's this season has been incredible because at Mons in the Belgium Portugal game, there were like 5 to 6 thousand. It was completely full. They completely packed the stadium. 6,000 fans. If you went to the south, which is like 2 hours from Berlin to the south, uh, was also 5 to almost 6,000 fans. In Amsterdam, a little bit less, but still good. And in Poland, well, it was 3,000 fans, but it was ice cold. If you can go watch the replay on Rugby Europe on YouTube, and you could see that the pitch looked like frozen. So um, it's it's growing, and the good thing it's growing in these countries. I don't like to cut minnows, but not rugby countries by nature,
Yeah.
or that for a long time have been so away from the big stadiums and the big games, but it's growing, and it's a good sign because, for example, I was commenting on the Germany Georgia game, and no one was expecting that Germany will end up losing by a margin of 11 points,
Mm.
and they scored even 2 tries against Georgia, which is something rather special. And for the fans at home, that might be the boost that new kids come in. I give there was interesting vibe in the stadium. You could see that the fans were not expecting it, and that made everything more special. Another example is it's growing. For example, in Germany also, it was broadcast on public television. So it's not only a private thing now, it's going to the bigger and wider channels. And that might be the cornerstone for these countries to start growing. Or
Francisco, you're on mute. Sorry.
ah, okay, so I was saying, for the Rugby Championship, it's growing, and it's when you have more on public television, and more fans, these teams might, most of them won't go to the World Cup or the next World Cup, but it's a sign that something promising is coming. Of course, the next World Cup is going to be in Australia, so the attention span or it won't be as much because in France it's close to the border from Netherlands and Germany and Switzerland and so on. But there's a, a common vibe that as Portugal did so well and Georgia have done also so well for the past five World Cups, that it's possible for other ones to follow the same path.
Yeah. And you're chatting about Germany, Georgia. So the final result there was Germany 17, Georgia 28. And I had a look at that and I thought that was obviously quite an interesting result. Um, but big one, and for us South Africans, there have been a couple of South Africans that have played for Georgia in the past. I know Michael Pops has played. I think he's involved in the coaching a little bit. I'm not sure. But another South African who played his last game is Rayner Parkinson. How much you know about him and a little bit more about the Germany result? Because that's obviously, as you have mentioned, is quite a good one. But I mean, there must have been a little bit more to the game.
Well, there's a couple of South Africans not only playing for Germany. Rayner is one of the most legendaries. There's also other two, for example, in Portugal, José Rodrigues or Luis José Rodrigues, is his name. He came from the Sharks or the Bulls Academy when he was 18 years old, 19, and came to Portugal to play. And also Cody Thomas, who's playing in Juan Normandie in the Pro D. So don't forget the Portuguese South African community is big,
Yeah,
and we haven't been able to tap in as much as we like because it's so far away. It's not easy to bring 3 or 4 players to a camp before the Rugby Europe Championship or the Men's Rugby Europe Championship. But as it was working for Portugal, Germany also tapped in, and it's like Rayner Parkinson, Sebastian Ferreira, who's playing in Nottingham.
yeah,
I think he was called for the last game against Georgia, but he couldn't come. And I think for the next two games, Spain and Netherlands, he will come and will add. I think he is one of the best players in Germany and one of the best South African German players they have in the setup. Rayner Parkinson is a legend because he's 35. He retired against Georgia, played 20 minutes, and look, he had a massive career for Germany. I think his first game was in 2011, and when Germany was in the second division in Rugby Europe, so the trophy division,
yeah.
and he helped them go to the top division, the championship. Played in a qualifier for the World Cup in 2018. So he has a long history in Germany, and I think his contribution to the game and for how the Schwarze Adler have grown in rugby was a big part on him.
Nice, thank you. Tyler, welcome. I apologize for starting ahead of you.
No worries. I'm just glad that you have been a good host to Francisco so far. Hopefully, Francisco Sean has been taking care of you. Um, I wanted to ask Francisco before we get into some of the nitty-gritty. So obviously, in a country like South Africa, you can't really run away from rugby. Like it's the most popular sport. It's pretty much everywhere. So I want to hear your story of how you got into rugby. I mean, obviously coming from Portugal and is rugby a game that is concentrated in certain areas? Did you just watch a random game? Was it the 2007 World Cup? What is your story of how you got into the sport?
Well, my story is I start my first tryout in rugby was when I was 11, and I hated it like every single minute of it. I remember going to practice because my father always loved rugby. He played for 2 seasons, long time ago. But then he brought me to Group 58, who are the champions at the moment, and I just hated it. It was night, cold, rain, mud, and I said to my father, no, this is not the the sport for me. And then when I was 16, I had a very good friend who played in another club, was a Grunemia, and he said, why don't you come try out? You're a big boy, you could do well. And said, okay, let's try it, and it clicked, and it was amazing because after 3 weeks. I did well. I was very fit at the time, so I landed a spot, and from then it was a journey of falling in love with it. I think the last click before the 2007 World Cup was the Six Nations 2006. I remember watching with some friends, drinking beer and eating shellfish in Lisbon, and said, "Okay, this is amazing because it's works so well and the vibe is immense. The stadiums are just awesome." So it went from there, and it's in Portugal is difficult to explain to you because people are gonna laugh. You have it's not a big country, but if you look to 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 it geographically, it should have more teams inside or to the north, but it isn't. It's mainly in Lisbon. So in the capital, you for example in the Premiership division, 7 out of the 10 teams are from Lisbon or from around Lisbon, and then you have one team to the north, one team to the center, which is Porto, Clube, who is in Porto, and Académica, which is in Coimbra, and another one next to Coimbra, it's Lausanne. So it's very few teams outside of Lisbon, and so it's a very, I'm going to say, very concentrated sport and very elitist. Now it's transitioned to becoming more middle class, lower class, whatever you want to call sport. But for a long, long, long time, it was like high class sport, and only the good boys could play. And now it's becoming a sport for everyone, for any type of. It doesn't matter where you came. It doesn't matter if you start playing with 17, 12, 8, 7, 21, 22. It's a sport for all, and the World Cup helped it because, well, I'm not. This is not to take against the guys from 2007, which some of are very good friends of mine, but
Mhm.
you could see that most of the players were from elite class, and now you have players from all around Portugal playing also in France. It's different. So people watch it at television doesn't get the feeling of, oh, this is hoity-toity sport. Now they say, okay, this sport for everyone, like handball or basketball. And well, let's see what happens in the next 4 years, because they're going to be vital to see if it capitalizes on the new public and the new possible new players, and it all depends on how well Portugal does in the men's and the women's team.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely exciting. And obviously, we have that platform from 2023. We saw just how much the country got behind it. There were apparently like record viewership numbers in the last game against Fiji. So that's really exciting. Unfortunately, the start of the new cycle started with the loss to Belgium. Sorry to bring the mood down for you, Francisco. But yeah, I think just maybe talk us through it because, of course, I'll put myself in these shoes. I would have expected Portugal to win. They've been traditionally one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the last like years or so. Belgium, haven't really heard too much about them. So was this something that was expected? Is it as big of a surprise to you as it is to the rest of us?
Well, no, it for me it was a shock. Half of my heart was expecting it because of how badly the union is handling the post World Cup
Hmm.
stuff. Because for the past 4 months, we didn't have a head coach. Well, we had a head coach for 2 weeks, and right after the World Cup, he was then resigned, and since then we had no head coach. And you could see that mostly the team, um, the mood came down, because if you don't have a staff that is all working at least 2 or 3 days a week with players or with the staff, whatever, like Lajski did, it's normal when they come in to camp on January that there's nothing palpable to start working on. And I didn't want to believe it, because Portugal has a lot of players in the Pro de Deux or some in the top 14, then Nacional. So when you think about those individualities coming in, you say, okay, at least if the game doesn't go well collectively, these guys are going to push it and drive forwards. But of course, you could see that most of these players were waiting for a game plan, because it worked with large scale. You can be Messi or Cristiano Ronaldo. If you go to a pitch and there's no game plan, and you face a team that's highly motivated to take you down for 80 or 100 or 200 minutes, you won't surpass them. And if people have the time, go watch the second half. If you don't want to watch the first half, go just watch the second 40 minutes. You can see that Portugal with Marta, Storti, Simon Bento, Appleton, they tried to run running lines alone to see if they could score a try, but it's impossible at this level. Teams like Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, or Poland have studied so hard the top teams, and they want to take them down because it's how if you get one scalp from these teams, everyone is going to watch you for at least 1 or 2 weeks, and that boost of notability is it's incredible. And I've seen that for Belgium this since Saturday, and for Portugal was like might be the turning stone for to turning around and wake up from well what was a World Cup dream now is a nightmare because no one wants to come out from winning against Fiji and then losing against Belgium. I like Belgium. I'm not saying that, but if you compare the two realities, it's you go from 80 to 8 like we say in Portugal, so
Yeah.
it's strange.
Okay, so maybe Francisco, you can also just help in just explaining how the Rugby Europe Championship works. So there's 8 countries. It's Spain, Portugal, Georgia, Romania, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and Poland. And as I understand it, they're separated into 2 groups. You play the other teams in your group, and then there's semifinals and finals, right?
Exactly. So the two top teams from each group pass to the I call it the golden semifinals because you have a chance to go for the crown. The
Mm.
bottom two teams from each pool go to the ranking finals.
Oh.
So yeah. So for example, Belgium, if Belgium gets to the golden semifinals, they're safe. So they won't get relegated. As in 2023, they finish in seventh. So if they went to the ranking semifinals and lost and went to play for the A7 place, it could be dangerous. But for the moment, this win against Portugal might be enough for them to stay on the top division. So it's
Mm.
bad news for Poland because now they have to forcefully win against. Well, they have to win against Belgium and wait for Portugal to win against Romania. So Portugal goes through to the golden semifinals and
Mm.
well leaves Belgium again. So it's interesting because even if you finish in the bottom two places in the pool, you still have a lot to play in, and we don't know
Mm.
how the qualification for the next World Cup is going to be. There's rumors it's going to only be during 2025, so which is even more cutting edge.
That's
And
late.
it's it's not late. Normally it's 2 seasons, so it should be to 2025 and 2026. But now, if it's to go only 2025,
Ah, yes.
you have
Sorry, I
five.
misunderstood. Yeah,
Yeah,
100%. That's
you have
crazy.
you have five less games to get to the World Cup. So it's if you lose one match in next season, and we don't know how it's going to work because and we everyone is waiting for World Rugby to decide how it's going to be. It's dire for any team. So if we were playing for qualification this year, Portugal would be in a very, very bad spot at the moment.
Mm.
So it's for now, it is this Portugal. If Portugal finished, for example, last year they uh, were defeated by Georgia in the finals, so second. If they finish in fifth, they still are in fourth in the standings. So it will be positive because then the worst thing that could happen to them is to fall in the same pool as Georgia. But if they get the two top spots, they go to the World Cup. Doesn't matter.
Mm. And then, yeah, so just talking about the nature of the 8 teams there. So is it as easy to go that the ones that went to the World Cup, Romania, Georgia, Portugal, and I mean Spain, bar obviously their eligibility issues have been consistent near the top. Is there a clear top four and a bottom four? Or I mean, we saw this weekend's games, all of them were within about, I think, 10 to 15 points. If not, obviously, the surprise victory of Belgium, Netherlands almost beat Spain as well. Or are the teams coming closer together more than ever?
I it's hard to say for because of one season for Portugal, Spain, and Romania. It's a rebuilding and a restructuring stage. Also for Georgia, but not that much. And the problem here is to see if Richard Cockerill can adapt to the way that Georgia plays and thinks rugby because it's very different. But going back to those three teams, it's a rebuild stage, and it's going to take time. Portugal needs to get the new Mike Tadger, if it's possible, the new Samuel Marks to replace the guys who retired. Spain is trying to find the new guys that push them over the edge, and Romania is it's the same. I think it's getting closer. This season will always be close. I had a bet before the Rex started that it will go very close because the other four teams would want to gather some scalps from these ones, and sometimes arrogance. You think you are just because you finish in third or second or first the last season, you're going to win again this one. And this last weekend, you seen that Germany didn't play around and try to win the match. Netherlands was close. Portugal lost to Belgium. Even Poland in the last 10 minutes showed some promise against Romania. So it's closer, but I wouldn't take like a guarantee that it's going to be always competitive like this because I don't know what happens next season. Let me just go to Portugal again. If Portugal gathers a staff that is closer to what Lagisquet had and go back to that stage of working with peace and with a steady mind and so on, they can go back to almost the same spot they were until 2023. So they will be back on their on the right trail. If there's no stuff or bad stuff, it can get ugly. How
Mhm.
Belgium showed today.
Yeah. So that's Portugal with a new coach. That's Georgia with a new coach as well. You said Spain and Romania as well, new
Yes, yes.
coaches.
Eh,
Jeez. Okay.
Even Belgium has a new coach.
Wow.
Yeah, Belgium had Mike Ford and Mohit Botha as the head coach and coach, but they resigned in August, and then they hired some Laurent Dossat in September. Portugal has no head coach at the moment. It's just
Hmm.
caretaker by Daniel Orcado with Eusebio
Yeah.
Menezes and so on. Spain has Pablo Bauza, who work in the Super Rugby Americas, high performance director, a position like that. And as you know, Georgia same. Romania, David Gerard, who work with Portugal. So it's normal that these teams need time to adapt to the new reality, new way to
Yeah.
work, etc. And that's that's the biggest thing. I think if Georgia had Levin Masashvili with them this season,
Mm.
they would have won by a bit more against Germany because Masashvili knows the players, knows how they work, the game plan, and so on. And I could see that Richard Cockerill is trying to change things a bit, but it will take time for players to adapt to it
Yeah.
to the new reality.
Francisco,
Sean,
um,
yeah, no, go
sorry,
on, Sean. Yeah.
Salah. So we all know that Georgia are the front runners to take up one of those roles in every World Cup. That's just been like that. How are they looking moving forward? And not just specifically Georgia, but for the rest of the teams. Do any have you got any insights into like Georgia, Portugal, Spain about how they're looking in 2 years' time? Like, do they have some youngsters coming through? Have they got the quality to make a drive once they set in with their new coaching staffs?
If we talk only about players, so it is a hypothetical case.
Yeah,
Georgia has like 20 to 30 players uncapped playing in the Nacional, Nacional 2, and the Predator in top 14 in the sport in Espoir and Carro. So in 2 years' time, they'll be mildly ready or completely ready to
yeah,
take the reins. If you could, the team against Germany, you had a lot of newcomers coming in, so they're preparing those guys for in 4 years' time or 3 years' time to be ready for the World Cup. The same thing with Portugal, same thing with Spain, the same thing with Romania. Not that much. Romania will basically have almost the same team from the 2022 2023 because they weren't that old, but they weren't just quite there yet. They were
yeah.
not mature enough to not mature, but rip uh, rip to take the job. So for Portugal, for example, they have like 13 or 14 players that still can be capped for Portugal and will get a level higher. The main thing here is the coaching stuff because and sorry for going back to it again because it's fundamental or key for the new head coach to understand the reality of these countries. It's not easy to have all the time the best players, because for example Portugal won't play with a single player from the top. No, we'll have just Pedro Betancourt, but Storti, Bento, Nicolas Martins, Francisco Fernandes, Antonio Alves can't play this weekend against this weekend against Poland because of their agreements with the clubs. So this is the main problem with teams of the emerging nations like in Europe. You have seen this with Fiji. When it comes October or November to play in the internationals, they want to call their players the best. But as the top 14 is going on in Pro D2, it's not easy to take them from the teams and can play, because most of them have 1 year contract or 2 year contract, and French clubs, well, and while I understand them, they say, okay, it's us or them. You can't beat
Mm.
them.
Mm.
And and
We all
it's
know the
and
French clubs do that a lot, eh?
it's well, French clubs do it, but sometimes they help. The problem with for me, it's better the French and the English, because every time a player from a let's call it T2 country try to play for Spain or for Fiji or so on, or Kenya, they just ripped apart the contract and said, okay, you next season you are not here. It
Oof.
happened with Joshua. It happened with that when there was a qualifier for the World Cup in Dubai. Kenya had one of their, not Ojo, I'll remember the name, that he was a very good player, very young player with 19 years old, but because he chose to play for his country of birth, at the end of the season, contract was ripped off.
Sure.
And it's a harsh reality, and that's why Patrice Lagisquet not staying with Portugal is massive, because Lagisquet would pick up the phone and talk with the French guys, and they
Mm.
would do agreement. The same thing could have happened with Spain, but they chose to go with Pablo Bauza, who's a very good coach in the training skills and the stuff. But for these countries, it's better to have someone from France or very well known in France, so they can talk directly eyes to eyes. Say, okay, this weekend we can have the player, but the next 2 weekends they are ours, and we'll arrange if he has an injury. You'll be contacted and so on. That's the main thing. The same thing will happen with Georgia now. You could see that Gela Pratidze and Vasil Obsharnicek couldn't come play against Germany because they opted to stay in their teams as their clubs asked them to stay. Vasil wants to get a full-time contract with Toulon, as he is there just as a joker, how you call it,
Joker. Yeah.
Medical joker.
medical joker until the end of the season, and he wants a contract to stay in Toulon. Of course, anyone of us would like that. And George
Mm.
said, "Okay, fine, you can go. There's no problem." But George has enough players to do it. But in the loose forwards chapter, there's not that much of space, because Beka Gorgadze is massive for Georgia and it's not playing for them because he has to stay with Section Palawas. And you could see that this can bring some misfortune for some clubs when they, or some teams, or when they don't do the right arrangements or balance the teams well enough. But it's sometimes, but most times, sometimes it can happen, like it happened with Portugal. They had Storti, Bento, Marta, everyone from the Pro D2, aside from Francisco Fernandes and Antonio Alves, and still lost.
Mm.
So it's, you need a balance of two. You need a very good coaching staff like Portugal had with Lajski, or Romania had with Andy Robson, who is for me one of the stories that we will never know what happened and why Andy Robson was forced to leave Romania, or why
Yeah.
he chose to leave. And it sometimes doesn't work, and that is the main problem.
Yeah. It's so interesting just thinking about these push and pull factors. I mean, I'm sure obviously you as a supporter of Portugal, you want, the likes of Storti and Martins to play in, the top leagues and to have that exposure. But the pretty much the main competition and the competition used for qualification, if they're not available for most of those weeks, that's also counterproductive as well. So it's such a balance, I think, for maybe even for fans to be like, well, I want the best for this player, but it can also disadvantage my club. I mean, I think you see it with football as well. Like a lot of like the non-European countries, if your best players are signed by the big European clubs, You can't really get them for, like, for example, the African Cup of Nations or the Asian Championship, whatever the case is. And it's such a it's such a complex thing, I think, for fans to get their heads around too.
Yeah, it is. That's why when Portugal loses, I'm going to give you an example. Well, today is Tuesday, and 2 hours before Spain published the team that's going to play for against Germany this weekend. And from the 32 player list, none is playing as a senior in the Pro de top 14. There's 3 or 4 guys from those clubs but play at the Espoir level, and 1 or 2 from Nacional. You could see that how Spanish fans lost their minds over the last 2 hours, because saying, "Oh no, we're going to play with a very depleted team because we need the professionals and so on," and it drives
Mm.
mad people because, of course, when you have great players like Joel Merkel who plays for Toulouse and doesn't come for play for Spain, people get anxious, because you have so many good players rocking at the club level, but then you can't pick them or in these 3 to 5 weekends. And when you try to explain this to casual fans from these countries, they start looking to you and don't get it. Why in football when they call or in handball when they call a player, he has to go. There's no there's
Yeah.
no here. He has to stay for the club and so on. And that's one of the main issues with rugby for me because
Mm.
I understand the clubs, but at the same time, these nations need those players not only to win games but to sell crowds. You know,
Yes.
I have friends now, mine who are not they are non-rugby fans, so they have never played. They have in the last 12 years they watched like 3 matches, and they all were from Portugal in the 2023 World Cup. And they asked me, "Is Storti playing?" So at the moment, Storti sells because he's a face. He's one of the
Tickets,
face.
yeah.
And it's the same. He said to me, "And Appleton. Appleton is playing." I said, "Yeah, Appleton will always play because he plays in Portugal, so he'll always be available for Portugal." But Storti, because he's becoming a such well-known player, they all ask it every time, "Is he coming to play? Is he coming to play?"
Mm.
And this is the main problem. When you try to explain this to all rugby fans, they don't understand because they only see the rugby as a collective sport, and it isn't. You need the individualities, you need the faces, and
Mm.
that's the gist of it. And when you have this and you can't win games or barely, for Spain won against Netherlands, who is not a bad team nowadays. Frankly,
Yeah.
it's a team that's
Yeah,
Lynn
it's on
Jones
the up.
working. Yeah, he's on the rise. Lynn Jones is a very good coach. Knows what he's doing with them. And Spain won and could have won for more than 2 points. And even then, they are not happy with it. So you can see that there's a lot of frustration in these countries with their future and present.
Okay, Francisco, I think we should try to make this a regular feature. You can just talk to us about, the REC and what's going on there. And there's a lot of questions that I think we all want to ask you about just the structures of World Rugby, how to fix this, how to make better. I know you're not shy with your views on what World Rugby is doing or not doing for the tier two nations. So I'm very keen to have that conversation. I think we'll have to wrap it up there. Maybe very quickly, a play that stood out for you this weekend?
Sorry, a player?
Yeah, what the play, like maybe your play of the week or the best play that you
Oh,
saw this
yeah,
week?
it's difficult for you to ask me this because after the games, it's one thing, and when I was doing my work for AB Europe and for other websites and doing with the stats, it changes because you start seeing the stats and say, okay, might this player that I thought played well with the stats, he didn't rock that much,
Mm,
but it's let me give a moment because from Belgium Portugal it's impossible to pick one. It was a great game in terms of environment and emotion, but it wasn't a great game as player wise. Romania Poland also wasn't that much. Okay, I have one from Spain Netherlands. One of the guys from the outside back, Marciano Cian, 20 years old. He's incredible. If people loved
mm,
Nuno Sousa Guedes stepping, you should focus on this guy. His last name is Cian, so Cian. He's incredible. His footwork is just special, and he can be one of those players that's at some point someone is going to put a clip on Twitter or
Yeah.
another social media and say, "Oh, look to this magician." But he will be my player of the weekend.
Yeah. Well, guess what I'm going to be doing tonight is try and look
Me
for
too.
YouTube videos of them. No, thank you so much,
Luck.
Francisco, and thanks for your expertise. Please follow Francisco Isaac on Twitter. Like it'll very much on the top, whatever, top two and not number two of like Twitter accounts to follow if you want to keep up with rugby, just on the whole global stage, and just realizing that this game is a lot bigger than maybe the 10 nations that we always focus on. And yeah, I think this Rugby Europe Championship is definitely shaping up to be a very surprising one already. So we have a lot, I think, that we'll be discussing and looking forward to in the next few weeks. So thank you so much, Francisco, for your time. And then yeah, thank you so much for everyone listening. We're gonna we just having a feature on looking at the Rugby Europe Championship. You know the drill by now. Please follow us on our social media platforms. Please follow us on our podcast platforms as well. Like, share, rate the podcast. Make sure that this podcast gets all the love that it deserves, or maybe that we beg for. And yeah, we will see you in the next episode. Bye bye.
Cheers, guys.